This video lecture is titled The Summer of Love. It lines up with the section titled Hippie Nation in your course textbook. The term the Summer of Love generally refers to the hippie movement in general of the 1960s, but more specifically, this period when it was all still innocent. Yes, there was heavy drug use involved, but there really was a great message of peace associated with this hippie movement. There's a song called Get Together by a band named the Youngbloods. I think the lyrics to this song really summarize the philosophy and sentiment shared by many in the hippie movement. The lyrics read, "Come on people now, smile on your brother. Everybody get together, try to love one another right now." Again, the summer of love, this age of innocence, with all of the horrors of the 1960s, the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, his brother Bobby Kennedy, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, the Vietnam War, these hippies, naive as it may seem to some, felt that they were on the cusp of a cultural and societal breakthrough. Today, we'll find out if they were right. Remember, the human being, which happened in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park in the Haight-Ashbury district in January of 1967, received mainstream and national press. All of a sudden, people all over the country, in particular young people, but also some older people, see this hippie lifestyle, and many people are very attracted to it. So people move to San Francisco in droves. Remember, if you're going to San Francisco, be sure to wear some flowers in your hair. There is now a national audience for this psychedelic rock, and this music is celebrated with 3 festivals between the summer of 1967 and winter of 1969. The first festival is called the Monterey International Pop Festival. This is not the first time I brought this up to you. The first time was back when we were talking about Stax Records. This was that festival, this hippie festival, where Otis Redding was introduced to this psychedelic rock crowd, and he was really embraced. They loved this music. They loved Otis Redding and this southern soul of Stax Records. Say that 5 times fast. This festival also marks Jimi Hendrix's return to America. Remember, Jimi Hendrix was American. He's born in Seattle, lived in Tennessee, lived in New York, but he wound up in London because he wasn't finding success here in America. But he was a huge hit in London. So finally, when he's built up all this success, he makes the move back to the States, and he's wildly successful. So this Monterey International Pop Festival, usually just referred to as Monterey, introduced both Otis Redding and Jimi Hendrix to American audiences. In addition to those two, there's a really great lineup. We have Jefferson Airplane, The Who, The Grateful Dead, Janis Joplin, The Byrds, The Animals, and the Mamas and the Papas. The Beach Boys were invited, but they declined. The Beatles had retired from performing. But still, what an incredible lineup that concert must have been. The concert is a huge success. It builds even more momentum for this psychedelic music of the hippie movement. 2 years later, in August of 1969, we have what may be the most successful and important music festival ever. It was a 3-day event called the Woodstock Music and Art Festivals, known colloquially as Woodstock. Now, this concert was 2 years later, but it actually features the exact same lineup as Monterey, only with 3 differences. 1, Otis Redding had already passed away. 2, Santana performs. I mentioned Santana very briefly on the lecture on San Francisco, but Santana is from San Francisco, and he's a blues, rock, psychedelic musician, but Carlos Santana is Mexican-American, and he really incorporates these amazing Mexican musical elements into his music. It's called Latin rock. Instruments such as bongos, conga drums, maracas, the whole gambit of popular Latin American musical percussion. We'll talk about Santana more in later lectures, but he'll be famous for songs such as Black Magic Woman, Oye Como Va, and in the late 90s, Smooth featuring Rob Thomas of Matchbox 20. Now this is a bit of a side note, but Carlos Santana is the front man. Many of the members of his backing band are eventually going to break off, find new singer Steve Perry, and start the band Journey. And the final difference is we have a band called Crosby, Stills, and Nash, a folk group made up of 3 men and one of the latest folk acts on the scene, but also one of the most important and impactful. Woodstock is their first public performance. However, the real highlight of Woodstock is Jimi Hendrix's rendition of our national anthem, The Star-Spangled Banner. Jimi Hendrix gives this amazing rendition with his Fender Stratocaster strung backwards, played left-handed, with his Marshall full stacks, with his arsenal of amazing playing techniques. And this was an interesting choice, and a lot of people warned him that it wouldn't go over well, because remember, this is right in the heat of the Vietnam War. Remember songs like I'm Fixing to Die Rag by Country Joe and the Fish? Most hippies were so adamantly against the war, and unfortunately, it becomes really easy to lose the distinction between being against the war and being against the country. But Jimi Hendrix had this intuitive feeling that even though these hippies strongly rejected the war in Vietnam on principle, they still loved America the country. In fact, their rejection of the war and their opposition of the war was an expression of their patriotism. So he gets up on stage and he plays our national anthem as only Jimi Hendrix could. The way he plays this song, with all of the distortion, the dissonance, the dive bombs, the squealing, it really seems to encapsulate the character and the emotions and the feelings of the world in 1969. This song sounds like it's going to explode at any moment, and the world felt like it could explode at any moment. Despite all of Jimi Hendrix's great music, he is most known for this performance of the Star-Spangled Banner. Well, in the summer of 1967, the Monterey Festival was a huge hit. In the summer of 1969, the Woodstock Festival was a huge hit. At this point, this music that came out of psychedelic San Francisco and London is really catching on. It's becoming more and more popular all over the country. And after two successful festivals, why not go for a third, right? The third is called the Altamont Speedway Free Festival. This takes place in December of 1969, so as close to the end of the 1960s as they could possibly get this performance. Because The Human Being was in January of 1967, we've had all of 1967, all of 1968, and now this is December of 1969, so all of 1969. For 3 years, psychedelic music has become more and more popular to American audiences, but the LSD culture of the hippie movement has made their music very divisive because, of course, the conservative listeners strongly reject this music. Altamont is just outside San Francisco, and the Rolling Stones were attached to this festival very early on. The plan was that they would headline, and they would get the rest of these really big acts to perform there. Well, unfortunately, some of the biggest acts aren't able to make it, although many are. However, a really bizarre choice was made. Rather than hiring professional security, they hired the Hells Angels. The Hells Angels are a motorcycle gang, and to this day, their reputation is for violence and selling and dealing drugs, in particular methamphetamine, also called crystal meth. But other than the fact that they are both associated with one particular drug, really the Hells Angels are the antithesis of the flower power hippies. The hippies are all about peace and love, and the Hells Angels have a reputation for horrific violence. Going into the final set of this concert, the Rolling Stones take the stage, and tensions are high. Sure enough, violence erupts, and one of the Hells Angels security guards kills someone right in front of Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, and the other members of the Rolling Stones. I cannot convey to you the amount of negative press coverage this event rightfully received. In fact, Altamont gave the anti-hippie movement all the leverage it needed to really put an end to it. So for all the potential and hope held by these flower-powered hippies, the LSD psychedelic experiment ultimately ends with this violent disaster. And it's apropos that Altamont takes place in December of 1969 because we really do have this firm ending to the 1960s. With Altamont, the 60s are over. The hippie movement is over. Peace and love, flower power is over. Now, the hippie aesthetic, this approach to music as being serious, focusing on virtuosity, that does not end. The musical contributions that we can pull from the hippie movement, those will carry on into the 1970s. But this large national hippie movement, that comes to an end. This focus on LSD, that comes to an end. But before that happens, all of this music really does break through into FM radio. So by this point, December of 1969, we have a firm split between AM radio and FM radio that is spread throughout the country. There are two types of radio now. One focuses on mainstream pop, the other focuses on music of the hippie aesthetic, virtuosity, long songs, elements of that nature. And again, the hippie movement comes to an end, but the music of the hippie movement, the music aesthetic, is just getting started. Perhaps the biggest slap in the face to these counterculture hippies is that by the time we get to 1969, 1970, hippie culture has gone mainstream. Any kid in Indiana can go to his local mall and buy clothes that only hippies would have worn a few years earlier. Tie-dye shirts, bell-bottom jeans, all that becomes mainstream, even though it started with these two subcultures in San Francisco and London. Now, I don't want you to get the wrong idea. While the psychedelic music is really gaining traction with mainstream audiences across the country, the music of Motown is still wildly successful. The music of Stax is still wildly successful. James Brown, Aretha Franklin, they're becoming some of the biggest names in music. And of course, the king of rock and roll is still going strong. In 1968, Elvis's contract with Colonel Tom Parker finally expires, and Elvis gains both creative and business control over his image as a musician and artist. In 1968, he releases the Comeback Special, which we've talked about before. It's one of the greatest performances of Elvis's career. He's still at the height of his powers as a musician and performer, but by this point, he's released so much incredible music. Over the last 14 years, you really get to hear some of his greatest hits in this performance. Two closing notes on the hippie movement. The first is that there is one song in particular which many people associate with the hippie movement today. This song is called Fortunate Son from 1969 by a band called Creedence Clearwater Revival, also known as CCR. This song is often used as background music when depicting the hippie movement or specifically the war in Vietnam. But the most famous instance of this is probably from the movie Forrest Gump. In case there was any doubt that the events that happened at the Altamont Festival in December of 1969 may have not entirely brought an end to the hippie movement, the most important figure to come out of psychedelia dies of a drug overdose just a few months later. he was 27. The close of 1969 doesn't only represent numbers changing on a calendar. As you've learned in this video lecture, significant events impacted music in 1969, and it really does feel like the closing of a chapter. To truly add a sense of finality to this closing, the group hailed by many as the greatest rock band of all time is going to break up and stop creating music together. We'll talk about that next time in our final video on the 1960s.